Thomas Holt had not been born a monster, but the sea, and the men who sailed it, had done careful work over 30 years. This is the story of a man who had lost everything that mattered, and of a little girl who did not yet know enough about the world to be afraid of him. The port of Boston in November of 1718 smelled of rotting fish, tar, and wet wood. It was the kind of smell that clung to your clothes, your hair, your skin, the kind you carried home without meaning to, and that was still there the following morning, reminding you of where you had been. For most of the men who worked that dock, it was simply the smell of work. For Thomas Holt, it was the smell of defeat. He was sitting on a thick wooden crate near the third pier, elbows driven into his knees, head tilted slightly forward. He was not looking at the ship. He was not looking at the sea. He was looking at the darkened planks of the dock, as though something was written there that only he could read. Some final sentence, some conclusion the world had reached about him long before he had reached it himself. The fog was thick that morning. The kind of fog that is not merely weather, but a state of mind, that erases the edges of things and makes everything feel provisional, as though the entire world might disappear if you blinked at the wrong moment. The port lanterns flickered weakly every 20 yards. Orange and yellow dissolved into gray, creating halos that illuminated nothing with great determination. Thomas was 46 years old, but he looked as though he had lived 80. His blonde hair, which had been golden in his youth, was now whitened at the tips, long to his shoulders, with two thin braids framed by bone beads he had received from a man who no longer existed. His beard was thick and unkempt, the kind that grows not from vanity but from a man who has stopped caring what he looks like to other people. A fresh cut ran above his right eyebrow, still raw, still slightly swollen, a souvenir from his last night aboard the ship, the last fight, the last thing that had gone wrong in a lifetime of things going wrong. His coat was dark leather, cracked along the sleeves, lined with fur that had lost most of its warmth years ago. Beneath it, a rough linen shirt gone gray from too many saltwater washes, boots worn through at the left heel, hands that told the entire story of his life without a single word, wide, scarred, calloused in the exact places that ropes and oars and knives leave their marks on a man over decades. He was not waiting for anything. That was the thing about Thomas Holt that morning. And it was the thing that made him different from every other tired man sitting on every other dock in every other port along the American coast. Those men were waiting. Waiting for work, for news, for a ship, for a meal, for someone to call their name. Thomas was not waiting. He had simply stopped, the way a clock stops when no one winds it anymore. Quietly, without announcement, without asking permission. The knife was in his right boot. He was aware of it the way you are aware of something you have made a decision about. Not with urgency, not with fear, but with a flat, exhausted certainty. He had been sitting there since before the first light came up behind the fog, and at some point in those dark early hours, something inside him had gone very still. He had thought once that he would feel something when he got to this point. Relief, maybe. Or terror. Something big enough to match the size of the decision. There was nothing. Just the fog. Just the smell. Just the distant groan of the ship behind him, rocking on the black water like it too had nowhere left to go. His name had once meant something in these waters. Not something good, he had never pretended otherwise. But something. Captains had lowered their eyes when Thomas Holt came aboard. Men had stepped aside in doorways. There was a version of respect that lived very close to fear, and Thomas had inhabited that border for most of his adult life, wearing it like armor, never quite understanding that armor is only useful when there is something inside worth protecting. Now there was nothing. The crew was gone. The ship, what remained of it after the dispute in Charleston, belonged to a man Thomas had never met and would never meet. His name was on no registry, no manifest, no record that any port authority would honor. He had 43 coins in a leather pouch inside his coat. He owed more than that to men he would prefer not to see again. He had no family. He had buried that possibility so long ago that thinking about it now felt like reading about someone else's life in a book he had found on the street. He had no friends. There had been men over the years who had come close, but the sea had a way of taking things from you, sometimes in storms, sometimes in ports, sometimes simply in the slow erosion of years and distance and silence. He had nothing. And then, small steps on the wooden planks, light, unhurried. The kind of steps that do not watch where they are going because they have not yet learned that the ground can be dangerous. Thomas did not look up immediately. He heard them, registered them somewhere in the back of his mind, and dismissed them. Children sometimes wandered the docks in the early morning, trailing after fathers or running errands for mothers with market baskets. It was not his concern, but the steps stopped, directly in front of him, and then a hand. Small and impossibly warm for that kind of morning, pressing itself over his scarred knuckles with the complete confidence of someone who has never been told that you do not touch strangers. "Are you sad too?" Thomas Holt looked up slowly. She was perhaps 7 years old, blonde hair straight and loose, catching what little gray light the fog allowed. A dark wool coat with 3 round buttons down the front, slightly too large for her frame, the sleeves coming just past her wrists. A small canvas backpack hanging from one shoulder, lumpy with whatever a 7-year-old considers essential. Her boots were scuffed but sturdy. Her cheeks were pink from the cold. She was looking at him with an expression he could not immediately name. Not pity, not curiosity exactly. Something older than both. The particular steadiness of a child who has already learned what grief looks like on a face, because she has seen it somewhere close, somewhere that mattered. She was not afraid of him. That was the thing that stopped Thomas Holt completely. Every person who had looked at him in the last 10 years, every dock worker, every merchant, every sailor, every innkeeper, had seen the scar first, the size, the coat, the expression that said, "Do not." They had adjusted themselves accordingly, stepping back, looking away, finding somewhere else to be. This child had walked directly to him, placed her hand on his, and asked him a question as though it were the most natural thing in the world, as though he were just a person. Thomas stared at her for a long moment. The knife in his boot felt very far away suddenly. Everything felt very far away. "What's your name?" he asked. His voice came out rougher than he intended, cracked from hours of disuse, from days of very little water and very little sleep. She tilted her head slightly, as though weighing whether he had earned the answer yet. "Eliza," she said finally. "What's yours?" "Thomas." She nodded as though this confirmed something she had suspected. "Why are you sitting here all alone, Thomas?" No one had said his name like that in a very long time, without a last name attached, without a title, a rank, a reputation trailing behind it like a shadow. Just Thomas, plain and direct, the way only children and people who truly know you say a name. He opened his mouth, closed it again. "Where is your mother?" he said instead. Something moved across Eliza's face then, fast, like a cloud passing over the sun, there and gone. But Thomas had spent 30 years reading the faces of men in the split second before they decided what to do, and he caught it. "She's not here," Eliza said simply. 3 words. The way she said them told Thomas everything he needed to know, and nothing he felt he had the right to ask about. Not yet. Maybe not ever. They looked at each other in the fog, the ruined man and the small girl, on a dock at the edge of a city that neither of them belonged to, in the gray early morning of a November day that had not yet decided what it wanted to be. Thomas Holt did not reach for the knife in his boot. He did not know yet what he was going to do instead, but for the first time in months, maybe longer, that flat, exhausted certainty had cracked open just enough to let something in, something small, warm, impossibly warm for that kind of morning. "Sit down then," he said quietly, moving slightly to one side of the crate, "before you catch cold." Eliza sat down without hesitation, her small boots swinging above the dock planks, her backpack on her lap. Neither of them said anything for a while. The fog stayed. The lanterns kept their small orange fires. The ship groaned behind them in the black water. But something had changed on that dock. Something neither of them could have named. something that had no word in any language Thomas Holt had ever learned in all his years at sea. Whatever it was the reason he was still alive when the sun finally, faintly, began to burn through the gray. And somewhere in the city behind them, in a place Eliza had not yet told him about, in a situation she had not yet described, something was waiting for both of them. Something that was going to require everything Thomas Holt had left, which, as of that morning, he had believed was nothing. He was about to find out he was wrong. Eliza had not wandered onto that dock by accident. Behind her small wool coat and steady eyes was a story Thomas Holt had not yet heard. One that would change everything he thought he understood about why she had sat down beside him. The fog had thinned by the time Eliza spoke again. Not much, just enough to see the outline of the buildings at the edge of the port, the dark shapes of rooftops and chimneys against a sky that could not quite decide between gray and white. Thomas had not moved from the crate. Eliza had not moved either. They had sat in silence for long enough that most adults would have filled it with something, with noise, with questions, with the nervous need to explain themselves. Eliza did not do any of that. She sat with her backpack on her lap and her boot swinging gently above the dock planks, watching the water the way children watch fire, without needing it to mean anything. Thomas watched her from the corner of his eye. He had spent 30 years reading people. It was a skill the sea demanded, knowing within the first minute of meeting a man whether he was the kind who would hold his nerve in a storm, or the kind who would fall apart and take others with him. He had learned to look past what people showed and see what they were hiding. It was not a gift. It was a survival mechanism, carved into him by necessity and repetition. What he saw when he looked at Eliza was something that made his chest tighten in a way he did not have a name for. She was holding herself together, carefully, the way someone holds a cracked cup, applying just enough pressure to keep the pieces in place, knowing that too much or too little and everything spills. The swing of her boot was controlled. The hands on the backpack were still, but the knuckles were slightly white. And every 30 seconds or so her eyes moved, just briefly, toward the far end of the dock, toward the street that led back into the city, checking, watching for something, or someone. "How long have you been out here?" Thomas asked. She considered the question seriously. "Since before it was light." Thomas said nothing. He did the arithmetic quietly. It was past 7 in the morning now. In November, in Boston, light came late. She had been out here since before 5 at least. Possibly longer. "Alone?" he said. "Yes." "Where did you sleep?" She pointed without looking, down the dock, toward a cluster of large cargo crates stacked against the harbor wall. Thomas followed her gesture and understood immediately. There was a gap between two of the largest crates, just wide enough for a small body, just sheltered enough to survive a November night if you had a wool coat and enough exhaustion to override the cold. He felt something move in his jaw, a tightening. The kind that came before anger, though he was not sure yet who the anger was for. "Eliza," he said carefully, "where is your father?" The boot stopped swinging. It was only for a second, one single second of absolute stillness, and then it started again, as though it had never stopped. But Thomas had seen it. "Gone," she said, the same tone she had used for her mother, flat, final, practiced, the way children practice saying hard things until they can say them without breaking. "Gone how?" Thomas said, because he needed to know, even though part of him already suspected. Eliza looked at him then, fully, directly, the way she had on the dock that morning when she first placed her hand on his, those clear eyes that did not flinch. "He went to sea," she said. 2 years ago. He didn't come back." The words landed on Thomas like something physical. He had heard versions of this story his entire life, in ports, in taverns, in the faces of women watching the horizon with a particular kind of patience that slowly, over months and years, curdled into something else. He had never been the man who didn't come back, but he had sailed with plenty of them. He had watched plenty of them make the same choice, consciously or not. The sea first, always the sea, and whatever waited on land would simply have to wait forever. "And your mother?" he asked, though he was afraid of the answer. "She got sick," Eliza said, "in September." "Is she 3 weeks ago?" Eliza said quietly. 3 weeks. This child had been alone for 3 weeks. Thomas looked at the backpack on her lap, lumpy, overstuffed, and understood now what was inside it. Everything she had left. Everything she had managed to carry out of whatever home had stopped being a home 3 weeks ago. "Is there no one?" he said. "No family? No neighbors who—" "There's a man," Eliza said, and something changed in her voice. Something careful came into it. "From the parish. He came to the house after my mother died. He said he knew a place for girls like me." Thomas went very still. "What kind of place?" "He called it a home." She said the word the way you say a word when you know it means something different from what it sounds like. "But the other girls on the street, the ones who went, they didn't come back either." "Not like my father. Different." Thomas looked at her for a long moment. "That's why you ran," he said. It was not a question. Eliza answered it anyway, with a single small nod. The anger that had been building in Thomas's chest since she first pointed at those cargo crates settled into something cold and very clear. He knew about men like the one she was describing. Every port had them. They moved through the spaces where people had stopped paying attention, through parishes, through poorhouses, through the gaps between one tragedy and the next, and they collected what no one else was watching. He looked at the end of the dock, at the street beyond. "He's looking for you," Thomas said. "Probably," Eliza said. She said it with the same flat steadiness she said everything else, but her hand tightened slightly on the backpack strap. Thomas Holt had come to this dock that morning with one intention. He had been certain of it in the way you are certain of things when you have run out of reasons to be uncertain. He had sat down on this crate and he had waited for the courage that never came, and he had begun to believe it never would. Now he stood up. It was not a dramatic movement. He simply unfolded himself from the crate, slowly, with the particular deliberateness of a large man who has learned to make himself seem less threatening when it matters. He stood at his full height, which was considerable, and looked down at Eliza. She looked back up at him without moving, without flinching. "Can you walk fast?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Then get up," Thomas said. "We're not staying here." Eliza slid off the crate and stood beside him, backpack on both shoulders now, chin slightly raised. "Ready?" Thomas looked down at her. This 7-year-old girl who had survived a November night alone between cargo crates, who had watched a man looking for death and decided to touch his hand instead, who said gone and sick and 3 weeks ago without letting her voice break even once. He had nothing. He had 43 coins and a knife in his boot, and a name that meant less than nothing in this city. But she had less than that, and someone was coming for her. Thomas pulled his coat tighter and looked toward the street. "Stay close," he said. And Eliza, without hesitation, without question, fell into step beside him, her small boot striking the dock planks in rhythm with his heavy ones, as the fog continued its slow retreat from the harbor, and Boston began, reluctantly, to wake up around them. Neither of them knew yet what was waiting in the streets ahead. But Thomas Holt was moving again, and that, for now, was everything. Thomas Holt had faced storms that split masts in two, and men who fought with nothing left to lose. But the most dangerous creature he had ever encountered was not the kind that came at you with a weapon. It was the kind that came with a smile and a document and the full blessing of the church. They had been walking for 20 minutes when Thomas first saw him. He almost missed it. The street was busy now, merchants opening shutters, women with baskets moving toward the market, cart horses clopping over wet cobblestones, and the man blended into all of it with practiced ease. That was the first thing Thomas noticed. How well he blended. How completely ordinary he appeared. He was perhaps 50, medium height, medium build, a dark coat, clean and well-fitted, a hat pulled low but not suspiciously so. He was moving along the far side of the street at a steady pace, and he was looking, methodically, without urgency, at every face he passed. the face of a man conducting a search with enough confidence to suggest he had conducted many before and had rarely come up empty. Thomas did not slow his pace. He did not look directly at the man. "Don't turn your head," he said quietly, his voice low enough that only Eliza could hear. "Walk normally." "Is that him?" Eliza's hand found the edge of Thomas's coat and gripped it. One finger. That was all. But it was enough. It was him. Thomas steered them left at the next corner, unhurried, as though he had always intended to go that way, and then left again into a narrower lane between two warehouses. The cobblestones here were slick with moss, and the smell of the harbor was stronger, thick and cold. He stopped in the shadow of a doorway and crouched down to Eliza's level. Her face was very still, too still for a 7-year-old. The kind of stillness that is not calm but control, the effort of not showing something too large to show. "His name is Reverend Aldous Crane," she said, before Thomas could ask. "He came to our house the day after my mother was buried. He said he had been watching over our family, that he had a house for children with no parents, that it was warm and safe, and that I would be fed." "But you ran," Thomas said. "Martha didn't run," Eliza said. "She lived 2 streets from us." "She went with him in October. I saw her get into his cart." She paused. "I never saw her again. I asked everywhere." Thomas held her gaze. "Did anyone else go with him?" "4 that I know of," Eliza said. "All girls, all around my age, all with no fathers." The cold in Thomas's chest had nothing to do with November. He stood up and looked back toward the mouth of the lane. No sign of Crane yet. But the man had been moving with the patience of someone who knew the geography, who knew which streets looped back, which alleys ended in walls, which corners allowed a clear view of the main road. He was not panicking. He was hunting methodically, the way you hunt when you know the prey has nowhere to go. Thomas thought fast. He had 43 coins. Not enough for passage out of Boston. Not for 2 people. Not on short notice. He had no contacts in this city he could trust. No name he could use that wouldn't bring its own trouble. The ship at the dock was not his. The men he had sailed with were scattered or dead. What he had was the lane he was standing in, a child gripping his coat, and 30 years of knowing how men like Aldous Crane operated. Because he had seen them before. Not in Boston, in other ports, other cities. Men who wore respectability like a uniform and used it to open every door that should have been closed to them. They depended on 2 things, the trust of institutions and the silence of people who had no power to speak. They lasted as long as no one looked directly at what they were doing. The moment someone looked, really looked without looking away, the entire construction collapsed. The problem was that looking required standing still, and standing still required not running. Thomas made a decision. "I need you to trust me," he said to Eliza. She looked at him with those clear, steady eyes. "I already do," she said simply. "I sat down next to you, didn't I?" Something moved in Thomas's face that he could not entirely control. He looked away for a moment, jaw tight, and then back. "We're going to walk back out onto the main street," he said. "Not running. Walking. We're going to find the magistrate's office on King Street." "Do you know where that is?" "I've passed it," Eliza said. "Good. When we get there, you're going to tell them exactly what you told me. Martha, the other girls, the dates, everything you remember." "They won't believe a child," Eliza said. Not bitterly, just factually, with the precision of someone who has already tested this theory. "They won't believe a child alone," Thomas said. "But you won't be alone." Eliza looked at him for a moment. "You'll come with me?" "Yes." "But you said your name means nothing in this city." Thomas almost smiled. Almost. "I said it meant less than nothing. That's different. A man with a bad reputation walking into a magistrate's office to report a crime is harder to dismiss than you'd think. It means he has nothing to gain from lying." Eliza considered this with the seriousness she gave everything. Then she nodded. They stepped back out into the street. Crane saw them within 30 seconds. Thomas felt the exact moment it happened. not because he was looking at Crane, but because the texture of the street changed. A slight shift in the flow of foot traffic, the way water shifts around a stone. Someone had stopped moving. Someone was recalibrating. He did not quicken his pace. He kept his hand, carefully, deliberately, not on Eliza, but near her, close enough that the meaning was clear to anyone watching. This child is not alone. This child has someone. Crane began moving toward them. He was good. Thomas had to give him that. He moved with the unhurried confidence of a man who believes he is operating within the law, because he had made very sure, Thomas suspected, that technically he was. Documents, signatures, the language of charity and Christian duty, deployed like a weapon. He was probably within his legal rights to claim guardianship of an orphaned child. He had probably done it a dozen times. He had probably never had a problem like Thomas Holt standing between him and the child before. They were 10 yards apart when Crane spoke. Eliza. His voice was warm, practiced, the voice of a man who had learned exactly how to sound like safety. There you are, child. I've been so worried. Thomas stopped walking. He turned and faced Crane fully for the first time. All of him, his full height, his scarred face, his 30 years of surviving things that should have killed him. And he looked at the man with the particular expression he had spent a lifetime developing. The one that communicated without a single word that he had seen through every version of this, and that he was not afraid, and that he was not going to move. Crane stopped. For just a moment, just one fraction of a second, something shifted behind his eyes. The warmth flickered. Beneath it was something cold and calculating, something that was rapidly assessing Thomas the way a man assesses an obstacle and decides whether to go around it or through it. This child is under my protection, Thomas said. His voice was quiet. It did not need to be loud. And who, exactly, are you? Crane said, recovering his composure with impressive speed. Someone who has already counted 4 missing girls, Thomas said, and is about to make sure a magistrate hears the same number. The street moved around them, carts, voices, the ordinary noise of a city that did not yet know what was happening in its middle. Crane's jaw tightened. His eyes moved to Eliza. And in that movement, in that brief flicker of calculation and frustration, Thomas saw everything he needed to see. He saw the truth of this man. Stripped of the coat and the documents and the warm voice. King Street, Thomas said quietly to Eliza, without looking away from Crane. Now, walk ahead of me. Eliza walked. Thomas followed, keeping himself between the girl and the man behind them, his steps measured and deliberate on the wet cobblestones. Crane did not follow. Not yet. But Thomas could feel the man's eyes on his back, cold, patient, recalculating, all the way down the street. Whatever happened next was going to happen fast, and Thomas Holt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, was ready. By the time the sun had fully burned through the fog over Boston Harbor, 2 lives had been permanently altered on a dock that neither of them had chosen. What happened next in the magistrate's office on King Street would echo through both of those lives for years, in ways neither of them could have predicted when a small hand pressed itself over a scarred one and asked a question that had no wrong answer. The magistrate's office on King Street smelled of candle wax and damp paper and the particular staleness of a room where difficult things were decided by men who preferred to believe the world was orderly. Thomas pushed the door open and held it for Eliza. She walked in without hesitating. The clerk at the front desk looked up. He took in Thomas, the coat, the scar, the size, the general impression of a man who had lived badly and outdoors, and his expression arranged itself into the particular combination of wariness and bureaucratic authority that small men deploy when confronted with large ones they cannot immediately categorize. "Can I help you?" he said. It was not quite a question. "We need to speak with the magistrate," Thomas said. "Today. Now." "Magistrate Harlow is occupied with 4 missing girls," Thomas said. "That's what we're here about. 4 girls, 1 name, and enough detail to open an investigation before another child disappears." The clerk looked at Eliza. She looked back at him with her clear, steady eyes and said nothing. She did not need to. The backpack on her shoulders and the November cold still in her cheeks said everything about where she had spent the night. The clerk stood up. Magistrate Harlow was a heavy-set man in his 60s with white hair and the expression of someone who had stopped being surprised by human behavior several decades ago. He listened to Eliza without interrupting. Thomas had told her on the walk over to say everything in the order it happened and to leave nothing out, and she did exactly that, sitting very straight in a chair that was too large for her, hands folded on the backpack in her lap, speaking in the same flat, careful voice she used for everything. Martha, the cart, October, 3 other girls Thomas had not yet heard about, names, streets, approximate dates, the visit to her house the day after her mother's burial. The warmth and safety Crane had promised, the way he had looked at her when she hesitated. When she finished, the room was very quiet. Harlow looked at Thomas. "And you are?" "Thomas Holt." Something moved across the magistrate's face. Recognition. Faint but present. The name meant something here after all, not something good. But Harlow was old enough and experienced enough to understand that a man with Thomas's reputation walking voluntarily into a magistrate's office was either desperate or honest, and desperate men did not bring 7-year-old girls with them. "You understand," Harlow said carefully, "that Reverend Crane is a man of some standing in this community." "I understand that standing," Thomas said, "is exactly what men like him depend on." Harlow looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Eliza again. Then he called for his clerk. Aldous Crane was brought in before noon. Thomas and Eliza waited in a small anteroom while it happened. Thomas on a bench, Eliza beside him, close enough that her shoulder touched his arm. She had not spoken much since giving her account to Harlow. She was doing the thing again, holding herself together carefully, applying exactly the right pressure, not too much and not too little. At some point, without either of them marking the moment it began, her head came to rest against Thomas's arm. He did not move. He sat very still and let it happen, and looked at the wall across from them, and felt something in his chest that he did not have a name for and did not try to name. They heard voices through the wall, not words, just tones. Crane's, smooth and reasonable at first, then tighter. Harlow's, measured and flat. Another voice Thomas didn't recognize, someone who had been summoned, someone with information. Then silence. Then the clerk appeared in the doorway. "The magistrate will see you." What Harlow told them, in the careful language of a man who has learned to say difficult things plainly, was this. Crane had done this before, not just in Boston, in Providence, in Salem, in 2 other towns along the coast, whose names Thomas did not recognize. There had been complaints before, from people who lacked the standing to make complaints that stuck. Girls taken under the pretense of Christian charity, placed in conditions that were not charitable, used in ways that Harlow described only obliquely, and that Thomas understood completely and felt settle into him like cold iron. Martha was alive. 2 of the others were alive. They had been located, not by Harlow's office, which had not been looking, but by a network of women in the poorer parishes who had been tracking Crane's movements quietly and carefully for months, waiting for someone with enough standing to make the accusation land. Eliza had been the piece they needed. Her account, combined with Thomas's presence, his willingness to stand in that office and put his name to it, had been enough to tip the balance. Crane would not be leaving Boston freely. Eliza listened to all of this without expression. When Harlow finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Will Martha remember me?" Harlow blinked. It was clearly not the question he had expected. "I believe so," he said gently. "Yes." Eliza nodded. She seemed to file this away somewhere important. They walked out of the magistrate's office into an afternoon that had turned, improbably, almost mild. The fog was entirely gone. The sky over Boston was pale blue and very wide, the kind of sky that appears after days of gray, as though the world is offering a mild apology. Thomas stopped on the steps. He did not know what came next. He was aware of this in the practical, immediate way he was aware of most things, without drama, without avoidance. He had 43 coins. He had a name that was worth slightly more than it had been that morning, and slightly less than it would need to be for anything simple. He had no ship, no crew, no plan. He had a 7-year-old girl standing one step below him on the stairs, looking up at him with an expression he was beginning to recognize, the one that meant she was about to say something direct that most adults would have softened or avoided. "Where are you going to go?" she asked. "I don't know yet," Thomas said honestly. "I don't have anywhere to go either," Eliza said. She said it the same way she said everything, not as a complaint, not as a manipulation, just as a fact being placed on the table for examination. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. He thought about the dock, the fog, the knife in his boot that he had not thought about since a small warm hand pressed itself over his scarred knuckles and asked him a question that had no wrong answer. He thought about 30 years of choosing the sea over everything that stayed on land. About all the things he had told himself that meant, and all the things it had actually meant, which were different. He thought about a 7-year-old girl who had survived a November night alone between cargo crates, who had walked up to a man looking like death and decided, for reasons Thomas still did not entirely understand, that he was worth touching. "There's a woman," he said slowly, "in Gloucester. I did her family a service years ago. She offered, she said if I ever needed—" He stopped, looked away, looked back. "It's a small house, near the water. She has 2 daughters. Eliza waited. "It's not much," Thomas said. "Is it warm?" Eliza asked. Thomas thought about it. "She keeps a good fire." Eliza picked up her backpack straps with both hands and adjusted them on her shoulders with the practical efficiency of someone preparing to walk a long way. "Then let's go," she said. Thomas Holt stood on the steps of the magistrate's office on King Street in Boston on a November afternoon in 1718, and looked down at this child who had walked up to the worst morning of his life and simply refused to leave him in it. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out the leather pouch, counted out enough coins for 2 fares to Gloucester and put the rest back. Then he walked down the steps and fell into stride beside her, this ruined man and this small girl, on the wide cobblestone street, in the pale blue afternoon, moving away from the harbor and toward something neither of them had a word for yet. But it was warm, and it was theirs, and that, in the end, was everything.